Welcome to Sustainability Bridges, a Eurosif podcast that aims to build bridges between policymakers, investors, academics and civil society around the theme of sustainable investment. Eurosif, the European Sustainable Investment Forum, is the leading pan-European association promoting sustainable finance and investment at the European level. In these podcasts, Eurosif's Executive Director invites distinguished guests for a 30-minute conversation on current events shaping the sustainable investment community.
Hello everyone, my name is Pierre Garrault and I am Senior Policy Advisor at Eurosif, the European Sustainable Investment Forum. For this episode of Sustainability Bridges, I am honored to be joined by Mr. Patrik Karlsson, Senior Policy Officer at the European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA. Patrik is a capital markets regulatory policy expert with more than 10 years of experience in EU legislative and regulatory engagement, and was previously Senior Director of Market Practice and Regulatory Policy at the International Capital Markets Association, ICMA. Together, we are going to discuss ESMA's recent reports and opinions on greenwashing and the future of EU Sustainable Finance Framework, the first takeaways from the implementation of ESMA's fund naming guidelines, as well as ESMA's supervisory priorities for 2025 in relation with sustainable finance. Dear Patrik, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. I hope that we can share some interesting views today, and hopefully it is of use.
First of all, maybe for our listeners who are not familiar with ESMA, could you briefly tell us about your organization, its role in the European finance landscape, its overall missions and objectives?
So ESMA, indeed. ESMA is the EU's financial markets regulator and supervisor. ESMA and the national competent authorities contribute to the development of the EU single market. We reach common interpretation of rules and we foster common supervisory approaches. We have some direct supervisory responsibilities that are important here. Non-EU central counterparties, credit rating agencies, EU critical benchmarks and their administrators, and more mandates are coming to ESMA's for ESG rating providers and external reviewers of EU green bonds. ESMA's mission, to use that language, is to enhance investor protection, to promote orderly financial markets, and to safeguard financial stability. Now, anyone can read that on the website, so fair enough, I'm not exactly sharing any secrets here, but those three priorities are very central to our work, and we do organize ourselves both in policy and supervisory development terms around them.
Great. Thanks, Patrik. So a lot of activities, a lot of things to do. And to give a bit more clarity on the upcoming work of ESMA this year, ESMA recently published its work program for 2025. Could you highlight maybe some of the key specific priorities with regards to sustainable finance in particular?
Sure. Our work is not done in a vacuum, obviously. We follow the direction set by the Commission and the co-legislators. So in the context of 2025, a big focus will be following what's happening with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, SFDR, and the planned review of it. We're obviously aware of and following the developments related to the so-called Omnibus Simplification Regulation. So we are looking at what's happening and a potential role for ESMA with regard to securities markets. In 2025, in general, we will intensify our focus on the implementation and supervision of the Sustainable Finance Regulatory Framework, and we are preparing for potential new mandates in this space as well. We are looking at technical standards, specifically under the Listing Act, the EU Green Bonds Regulation and the ESG Ratings Regulation. On the supervisory side, we're working what we call a common supervisory action on sustainability. We are preparing to publish the results of a common supervisory action in the investment fund area on compliance with SFDR and the UCITS and AIFMD requirements on the integration of sustainability risk. We are also preparing work on an ESG disclosures under the benchmark regulation. There's some CSA coming on that. And we are looking at new supervisory mandates also under the EU Green Bonds Regulation and the ESG rating providers. So work is ongoing there in 2025.
Great. Thanks, Patrik. And you mentioned SFDR, so maybe I can ask a question more specifically on this. So the European Commission, as you mentioned, is expected to publish a review on SFDR this year. Can you remind listeners on what is ESMA's role with relations to the EU regulations in general, and more specifically this SFDR, and what specific areas of work are you focusing on right now?
Certainly. So the ESAs, not just ESMA, EIOPA, and EBA, one of the key roles that we play in the EU sustainable finance and the financial regulatory framework is to develop regulatory and implementing technical standards, which essentially we call level 2. If the level 1 is the framework legislation, then the kind of technical detailed rules are developed by the ESAs under the so-called level 2 process. That's in the form of technical standards that the Commission eventually adopt. So in that role on SFDR specifically, we have developed very significant technical standards over the past 5 years. They are divided into two parts. Essentially, they are the standards and the technical details relating to the principal adverse impact disclosures for entities, financial market participants, they're called in the SFDR. And the other big part of the technical standards are the product disclosures. So the financial product disclosures in pre-contractual and periodic documents and on websites of financial market participants. So under that framework, we have developed technical standards there. They have been adopted in the form of a delegated regulation. And it is very likely that now that the framework legislation SFDR is undergoing a review, that the ESAs will be asked to develop technical standards underpinning the changed framework. The extent to which SFDR may change or not, of course, remains to be seen, but certainly we believe that ESMA's and the other ESAs' role in developing technical standards will remain, and we will have our work cut out for us after the political debate on the SFDR is done.
Yes, and at Eurosif, we are very supportive of your proposals, in particular when it comes to identifying new social principal adverse impacts, as well as simplifying also the disclosures from the templates, the SFDR templates. And hopefully these will be picked up by the European Commission in that upcoming SFDR review. So you mentioned also the principal adverse impacts, which is a key aspect of SFDR, of course. And so ESMA has a role in also assessing the quality of those disclosures and their actual publication and their relevance, and recently published a report on those different aspects. So could you share maybe the main takeaways of this report, and how what are the progresses that you can see in PI's disclosure?
Certainly, Pierre. So indeed, the ESAs have been given a role under Article 18 of the SFDR to publish an annual report into principal adverse impact disclosures. It's the task is to assess the extent to which the disclosure has been taken up. This is because the entity level disclosures are not mandatory for all financial market participants. They are voluntary for some, mandatory only for large financial market participants. So that's an important part of this exercise. But we have taken it upon ourselves to expand a little bit the scope of this annual exercise, to also do a kind of general kind of check-in about how these important disclosures are going. And so 2024, last year's report, was the third report that we've done. We have to publish it. We have to submit it to the Commission by the 10th of September every year. We were a little bit late last year, and we published it in October. Nonetheless, the report found significant improvements in the disclosures. It was an important year for us because it was the first time that we could properly take into account the disclosures made under the technical standards that I mentioned previously. So we have developed a template for the entity disclosures, not just the product disclosures, for principal adverse impact, and we have developed mandatory indicators and opt-in indicators that are used by financial market participants. So it was very good to see this disclosure done according to our technical standards for the first time, and we could assess them. And indeed, we found a significant improvement over previous years. I'm not attributing that to our technical standards specifically, but also to the good work of the financial market participants who are becoming more familiar with disclosures done under the SFDR and the principal adverse impact disclosures in particular. So for those unfamiliar with it, basically it really is what it says, so that the disclosures are basically an attempt to find out what the negative consequences are of the investments made by financial market participants. So eventually you have to look through what the investment is in and measure the bad things that happen, basically. And so this disclosure is very important from this perspective because it allows anyone, these are public disclosures after all, to look at the performance of financial market participants, how much greenhouse gases they are funding for example, and other negative consequences for both the environment and society. So that's very helpful. And it did. And in our assessment in 2024, we found significant improvements in the levels of the disclosure. We found that the indicators have been used. We only found a few non-compliant disclosures among the ones that we checked and the ones that our supervisors looked at. So that's a very helpful finding. The one thing we did note is that when financial market participants do not disclose or choose not to disclose their principal adverse impacts, those explanations justifying that decision were sometimes lacking. So typically, financial market participants are not very forthcoming in their public disclosures about why they have not, and fail to give a good reason and a good timeline for when they expect to start, basically. So that was the one drawback that we found, but overall the picture was a good and healthy one.
And I mean, we've heard some criticism on entity level PIs, and you're telling us right now that things are actually improving and that these metrics are actually relevant, and that you actually assess, improvements in their disclosures and how they also allow to identify how financial markets participant can, better deal with their adverse impact and what are the policies that they implement to mitigate those, right?
That's right. Actually, it's an important part of this whole element of SFDR. The PI disclosures, or principal adverse impact disclosures, I shouldn't be joining you in the use of abbreviations, but so the principal adverse impact disclosures is important not only because it's not just information about the adverse impacts. The European Commission has issued an interpretative Q&A on this very question, like what does considering your principal adverse impact mean? And it's not just the information about the adverse impacts, it's also the policies put in place to mitigate those impacts. And how can you mitigate them if you don't know them, indeed? So it all hangs together quite nicely, actually. And it would be a shame if these entity level disclosures were somehow negatively impacted by the review. Of course, look, we fully understand the effort being done on simplification and streamlining of sustainability reporting. That's fair enough. But I would be sad to see a negative impact on these important disclosures.
Yes, and this is also something that will be dealt with in parallel with the EFRAG work on financial institutions sector-specific standards that are currently being developed. And here it might be, interesting to keep those disclosures more specifically for that. So in close relation with the SFDR and the SFDR review in particular, a key document that was published by ESMA in recent months are the guidelines on fund names using ESG or sustainability-related terms. Could you briefly explain to our audience why, firstly, these guidelines were drafted? What is the use for them? What are the expectations that you set in those guidelines for these funds that use specific terms? And what is the timeline for their application by the different national competent authorities?
Certainly, Pierre. The work on naming started really from SFDR, and they flow very much as a consequence of SFDR. Essentially, with a transparency framework like SFDR, the actual criteria for financial products and how they become sustainable are left very much to the financial market participants. What we were concerned about was the risk of greenwashing stemming from a disclosure-only framework, in particular relating to how sustainable products can be. Now, in ESMA's competence lie mainly investment funds for this area. And indeed, if you look at the financial products that are in scope of SFDR, investment funds form a very significant majority of the products that investors, especially retail investors, buy in the EU. So for that reason, we decided to take action specifically on investment funds. Actually, some may know that there was some thinking done on this already by ESMA in the supervisory briefing that we published in May 2022. There's a paragraph there about some good and bad examples of what potentially could be misleading names. Another important development that occurred around this time as well was changes in the UCITS and AIFMD. Those are the two directives that govern the investment fund universe in the EU. There were some empowerments, I should call them mandates, actually given to ESMA to develop guidelines on situations where a name of a fund can be misleading. So with those two developments happening, we decided to first publish a consultation paper on guidelines on fund naming and specifically related to the sustainability and ESG terms used in fund names in late 2022. And then throughout 2023, we then developed a final report, which we published in May 2024 with the final guidelines. We completed the translation and publication of the guidelines in August 2024 last year. And that really kicks the clock. So if you allow me, Pierre, I'll explain first the timeline, and then I'll go into the substance of what the guidelines are and what they do. So in terms of timing, indeed, the 21st of August then starts the clock, essentially. So 3 months from that, after that period, 21st of November, pardon me, the guidelines started applying for new funds, so funds created on or after the 21st of November. And there's a transition period for existing funds that lasts 6 months from that date. So that would be the 21st of May of this year, 2025. And so from that date, the guidelines will apply to all EU funds. So what are the guidelines and what did they do? So and why did we launch them? So in order to provide some kind of certainty for investors about what a fund does, we felt the name was very important. It's the most immediate identifier of a fund and what it does. So if a fund uses ESG or sustainability related terms, that should have some consequence, we felt quite strongly about this. It's not enough to only have disclosures about what they do through SFDR. We felt there was a need for certain basic minimum criteria for the use of those terms. Now, some have called this a labeling exercise. It's not that. It doesn't create categories. We can have a separate discussion about that, Pierre, about the future of SFDR, where we indeed think we should move to categories. But we wanted to provide a kind of minimum level of investor protection here through the guidelines. So what the guidelines do is that when a certain term is used in the name, then certain criteria have to be followed. And they really are minimum criteria. So there's one threshold, which is common to all terms, and that's the 80% of investments used to meet the characteristic or objective of the fund. Now, 80% sounds like a lot and it sounds like a very significant threshold, but this is not considered to be a very significant threshold. The reason is that the way you work out what the investments are that are used to meet the characteristic or objective is basically taken from SFDR, where it's basically just a measure of how much of the fund is used towards the particular characteristic or objective identified under SFDR. And it's, for example, very easy to do under an exclusion fund, because simply by excluding something, all of your investments are used to meet that characteristic. So for example, so that wasn't considered very significant, but it's still important though, because it should provide some kind of link between what the name implies that it does and what the fund actually does. And then we have exclusions as well. So we have taken the exclusions from the benchmark regulations, delegated regulation for EU climate benchmarks. There are 2 climate benchmarks, the Paris Aligned benchmark and the climate transition benchmark. And we have taken those exclusions and applied them to different types of terms. So the terms are divided into 3. Essentially, there's the environmental terms, there's the social and governance terms, and then there's the sustainability terms. Under the environmental and sustainability terms, the Paris Aligned benchmarks exclusions apply. The key difference between the Paris Aligned benchmark and the climate transition benchmark exclusions is that the Paris Aligned ones have fossil fuels exclusions. And then the social and governance terms and transition, importantly, those terms then attract the CTB exclusions, the climate transition benchmarks, which are the PIB exclusions, but not the fossil fuel ones. What are the CTB exclusions? They are tobacco and controversial weapons and violations of the UN Global Council and the OECD M&E guidelines. So that's the multinational enterprise guidelines. So those are the three key common exclusions. And then for the sustainable and environmental terms, the fossil fuel exclusions apply as well. They're a bit complex. They're not a blanket exclusions. They're based on the revenue derived from fossil fuels, and there's specific thresholds for them. There's 1% of revenue for coal, 10% for oil, and 50% for natural gas, basically. So that's the exclusions then. And then we have a couple of specific criteria for specific terms as well. We found in the consultation phase that there was a lot of requests for slightly more specific criteria for specific names. So one is transition. So not only should transition terms have the CTB exclusions and the 80% threshold, they should also have investments that are on a clear and measurable path to transition. And then we also have something for impact, where the word impact is used. That should be also for investments that have a positive and measurable impact. The final thing is the sustainable category of terms. They have the 80% and the PAB exclusions as mentioned, but there's also this second category of criteria here that are meant for sustainable terms, and that's relating to sustainable investments. We consulted on a threshold of 50% of sustainable investments for any funds with the sustainable term in the name. In the final report, we removed this threshold, but it's important to stress here that we did not reject 50% because 50 was wrong. We instead moved to a more general term called meaningful. So we requested that funds with the sustainable term in the name should meaningfully invest in sustainable investments. And then the interpretation of that was left to the national supervisors. So that's how the guidelines work. Now, if you allow me, I've been droning on for quite a while, Pierre. Sorry about the guidelines, but obviously they're a hot topic right now as they're coming into application shortly. So if I may just add one thing, in December, we published 3 Q&As clarifying some of the key concepts in the guidelines, which were much requested after the publication of the final report. So the first Q&A relate to green bonds. It was I would say this bluntly, an unfortunate side effect of the way that the exclusions work, that there was no differentiation made to how the issuance was done. And so, of course, it's perfectly possible, for example, for a fossil fuel company that would fall foul of the exclusions to issue an instrument like a green bond funding something very specific. For example, that could even be taxonomy aligned, that obviously your money is not then going to fund the rest of the company. It's only financing that specific project. So we published a Q&A basically saying that the exclusion should not be applied to the European green bond. That's the green bonds established by the new regulation on European green bonds, that they can be overlooked for that. For non-European green bonds, we say that the fund manager should look through to what is being financed and make sure that none of the excluded activities by the PAB exclusions are funded, or CTB, depending on the type of term used, of course. So that's the Q&A on green bonds. The second Q&A relates to controversial weapons. There were many questions about what is intended by controversial weapons in the exclusions, and we simply published a Q&A saying that you can refer to the list of controversial weapons in the SFDR delegated regulation. There's a principal adverse impact indicator, number 14, that has a list of controversial weapons that those can be referred to for the purpose of the guidelines. And the third one, perhaps the most discussed one, is this meaningfully investing in. So now, coming back to this meaningfully investing in sustainable investments, despite our determination in the final report that the funds should invest meaningfully in sustainable investments, we were requested quite forcefully to provide some clarification about what could that be, so that there is some common understanding of what the meaningfully investing is. So we published a Q&A saying that if a fund invests less than 50% in sustainable investments, that is not meaningfully investing in sustainable investments. But I do stress that this is a Q&A on the guidelines. It's not binding in that sense. It's simply guidance. on what the supervisors might expect from funds with that term. The level could be higher. There is discretion given here to the national supervisors. So that's quite important. So yes, sorry for going on for such a while, but yeah, indeed, there were lots of things to clarify here with the guidelines.
No, thanks a lot. A very comprehensive view of the ESMA guidelines and their update in December as well. One thing that is interesting to specify on this look-through approach for use of proceeds instruments is that it doesn't apply to violations of UN GCs and OECD guidelines as well. So on this specific topic, it's still assessed at entity level, right?
That's right. So the basic reason for that is that that's an exclusion that we could not translate into activities. It really applies to a whole company, basically. And therefore, that particular exclusion cannot be excluded. Sorry for the multiple use of the word exclusions, but indeed, that's the exception to this look-through, correct? Yes.
No, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Patrik. And I mean, these guidelines are indeed very an important step for the EU Sustainable Finance Framework. And I mean, we support those. I think the establishment of basic exclusions, depending on the use of fund names, is a very important step forward. And we can see that in the context of the SFDR review, this approach has also been taken up by the Platform on Sustainable Finance, for example. In their recent report, they also propose minimum exclusions that apply horizontally throughout their proposed, so 3 categories, including or referencing also climate transition benchmark and Paris-aligned benchmarks exclusions. So we are happy to see that the market is, starting to apply those as well to modify the fund names or their characteristics, and that EU policymakers are likely also to build upon those guidelines in the context of the SFDR review. And maybe so focusing still on SFDR, which is a very important topic, it would be interesting to hear what are ESMA thoughts on where SFDR should actually be going. So there was a joint opinion from the ESAs on that topic. So I'd be happy to hear your thoughts and what ESMA thinks in where we should be going. So you mentioned that ESMA would be supportive of establishing clear categories of products. Are there any additional recommendations that you would have for the future of SFDR?
Certainly, Pierre. Happy to talk about this, and it's very much related to the guidelines. So indeed, in our opinion, which we published last summer, we provided some food for thought for the Commission to consider in its review. And we really think that the key change to SFDR is to bite the bullet and move away from a transparency-only system to clear criteria for product categories. We can call them labels if you want. The FCA does perfectly well, but we prefer the word categories because I think the important element for us, the ESAs, is the supervision of those categories. We certainly view them as more like regulatory categories where the supervisor approves the use of the category. There's many things that flow from such a transformation of SFDR from transparency into product regulation. One would be obviously, and it's related to the guidelines, is naming and marketing should follow that categorization system. We think that the categories could work if they are voluntary. So products do not automatically become category products. The product manufacturer would have to go through a process of basically applying for the category, and it would have to be approved for that by the supervisor. And it would also mean that if the product manufacturer didn't want to be in a category, it doesn't have to either. But there should be a kind of carrot and stick approach to this. The carrot is that if you are in the category and you fulfill the criteria, then you are allowed to call yourself according to that category in the name, and you're allowed to market a financial product according to the criteria of that category. And conversely, if you're not in that category, either by choice or because the financial product doesn't do something that is in the categories, then you should not be allowed to call yourself according to that or market the fund accordingly either. So that's the kind of key change we believe should happen here. We propose 2 categories, sustainable and transition. I know many others have proposed 3. For example, the platform that you refer to in their recent report on categorization, they propose 3 categories. That could work as well, but we believe that the category should be ambitious, should have clear science-based criteria as well. So in that system, we thought it better to have 2 categories with higher ambition rather than 2 categories and 1 with lower ambition. We also propose something we call a sustainability indicator. When I say propose, we really ask that the Commission consider its feasibility. And what we call a sustainability indicator, you could call grading as well. So a kind of grading scheme for investors to understand how sustainable, how green, or how socially sustainable a particular financial product may or may not be. The reason we asked the Commission to explore this is that in the consumer testing that we did as the ESAs for the templates for financial products, we found a lot of investors were confused by the terms that we have to use by law, like the taxonomy, for example, sustainable investments, and all this. And investors found that confusing and could not understand which product was more sustainable or not in a kind of blind test. So I shouldn't call it a blind test, a testing scenario, basically. So that led us to believe that a grading scheme from A to E or 1 to 5 or whatever could be better and at showing and giving especially the retail investor an intrinsic understanding of how sustainable that product is. We fully recognize this, and we lay it out in great detail in the report also that this could come with downsides, because designing that grading scale could be very difficult. If it's a universal scale for all products in different categories, then depending on how the criteria are done, it could almost inevitably lead to transition products being worse than sustainable products. And that would not, I think, meet the objective here, which is also to foster the transition and to encourage transition-focused products. If the scale were done within the products, then comparability would go down. You couldn't now compare, for example, products outside the categories, but that could be a better way of saying that within this category, this is how sustainable or not the product is. But anyway, that's food for thought for the Commission. We also have a bunch of technical suggestions with regard to the disclosures and how they're done, but I won't bore you with that, Pierre. The big recommendation from us is categories, voluntary categories with clear criteria.
No, I'm never bored by SFDR, but it's true that listeners that want to have your recommendations more in detail can access this report on ESMA's website. So maybe now taking a step back and looking at also the overall role of ESMA in relation to sustainable finance. One of the key aspects of your organization is to prevent greenwashing as well on the European level. And in that sense, so ESMA with the other ESAs worked on 2 different reports on greenwashing. The first one being published in 2023 and offering a first general definition of greenwashing across financial markets. And the second one being published in June last year, focusing on recommendations to national competent authorities and other different actors in the market. Could you quickly summarize what are the ESA's recommendations? So first of all, maybe starting with this definition or this overall idea of greenwashing, and then going into the specific recommendations.
Certainly, Pierre. In this case, I will actually stick to ESMA because the ESAs publish separate reports. So AOPA and EBA have their own reports. Don't worry, you can ask them what their conclusions were. I mean, it's not that different from ours, of course, but ESMA, we focused a little bit more on the financial markets and the investment funds area, which is in our competence. So you have very well summarized the 2 reports. Indeed, it's important to stress that although they're called progress and final report, they really do different things. So for any real greenwashing nerds out there, I recommend reading both the progress and the final report, not to consider that the final report is just the final version of the progress one. So in the first report, you're right, we provided this kind of theoretical framework for the definition for greenwashing. It's really an EU-wide supervisory risk assessment. We made a number of findings there. We found that sustainability claims are often not well substantiated. For example, about the performance and the real world impact of whatever claims were being made. We found a concern about the misleading use of these sustainability or ESG related terms in fund names, of course, which supported the work that we were doing separately there in our guidelines. And we found some overstatements on the extent that advice takes sustainability into account. We found that effective supervision is one of the key tools here in supporting financial market participants' understanding of the requirements, while the increased supervision also works as a market discipline mechanism where needed. And we were, at the time that we published the progress report, starting to see some start to the enforcement cases in the EU. Those have only become more frequent and grown in importance since then. And that kind of brings us to the final report, where exactly as you said, we really focused on the supervision element of greenwashing. We made several recommendations to our supervisors in ESMA. So we noted that they favor taking a kind of gradual approach, but our expectation from ESMA side is that in the next few years, they will deepen the kind of critical scrutiny of sustainability related claims. We ask that they further embed greenwashing risk in the supervisory cycle, we call it, basically the tools that they use. And we ask that the NCAs consider using multiple data sources to build a better monitoring of greenwashing risk. We also recommend certain additional tools, technical tools, we call them subtech, nothing to do with soup, but supervision, indeed, supervisory tech tools. And there is cooperation here among NCAs, and we ask that they cooperate with each other and with us to build a dialogue to better monitor and enforce greenwashing risk. We also recommend that the European Commission reinforce the supervisor's mandate regarding the promotion of retail investors' financial literacy, very important, and that the Commission foster ESMA's and NCA's access to data and support convergence and capacity building. We're not idle on this front. We support the NCAs ourselves as ESMA on greenwashing monitoring, capacity building, access to data, deployment of these specialized tools, and where needed, we produce additional guidance for market players and supervisors. On ESMA alone, we have a growing body of Q&As, for example, that provide not only answers to the market, but also guidance for our supervisors about specific aspects of SFDR, for example.
Very interesting. Thank you, Patrik, for this overview of the two greenwashing reports. And that brings us maybe to our last topic to be discussed today, and that's the future of EU sustainable finance. So we've seen recently some change in the way that sustainability reporting is addressed at the political level, with notably this omnibus initiative from the European Commission to streamline sustainability reporting rules. So what would be your perspective on this current effort?
Let's look at the reality that we're in with regard to the sustainable finance framework right now. In the context of simplification and streamlining, we shouldn't lose sight of what's important and why we're doing this. Transparency about sustainability is important. It's inherently important, and it should not be seen only as a burden. Of course, there are costs involved, and we have to assess those and provide the necessary simplification, the streamlining, to the avoidance of duplication. And that's a big focus for us and the EU this year and the following few years, for sure. But let's not lose sight of the importance of transparency, not only SFDR, but other legislation as well. Corporate transparency, financial transparency. It's very important that we understand the impacts on sustainability, the lack of sustainability. Those are all important things and worth keeping and valuing. And that's very much the main message that we have in our recommendation.
Great. Thanks, Patrik. And it's true that in the current context, I think it's important to remind, at least that's what we are trying to do on the Eurosif side, to remind EU decision makers of why we did the things that we did and why these rules are to be implemented. And if we take sustainability reporting, for example, it was a demand from investors to actually get the sustainability data that would enable them to make informed investment decisions. And we can argue that these, or the data, the sustainability data, is underpinning the entire EU sustainable finance framework. So maybe indeed that's also what we advocate for, is that maybe before making sweeping changes, we should have a specific, look at what is the information that is actually relevant and material for investors as well.
Certainly, Pierre. I thank you for your work. You do good work in Eurosif, and we appreciate that. And these are indeed important messages. that if you take a ledger and only put something on one side of the balance sheet, then you lose sight of the value of all of this. And let's not do that over the coming years.
Great. Thanks a lot, Patrik, for joining us today and for this very interesting and comprehensive conversation.
Thank you, Pierre.